Lately, there have been some debates over the length of movies and whether they should be shorter or longer. Those debates have been spurred over the fact that a lot of movies that have been released in the past year, or will be released later in 2023, have been very long. Let's go over some examples, shall we? The Batman was 177 minutes. RRR, or Triple R as I tend to call it, is 182 minutes. Avatar The Way of Water was 192 minutes. Babylon was 189 minutes. John Wick Chapter 4, the longest in the series, was 169 minutes. And Ari Aster's Beau is Afraid is 179 minutes. If reports are to be believed, Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer will be about 3 hours long, and Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon will clock in at about 4 hours. The fact of the matter is that big movies survived the pandemic and are back with a vengeance. It's hard to say exactly why movies seem to be getting longer and longer, but this outcry against long movies is a little bit, what's the word? Over-exaggerated? I could use the tired argument that the same people who complain about movies being between 2.5 to 4 hours long are those who binge entire seasons of television within a day or two on Netflix, but no.
That's bait.
Instead, what I would say is that a movie can be as long or as short as it needs to be to tell its story. I've seen gargantuan epics that I could easily consume a couple more hours of, and I've also watched 80 to 90 minute films that were absolutely miserable to sit through. It doesn't matter how long the movie itself is, what does matter is how everything comes together in the edit. If the audience's time is being used to great effect and the story justifies its length, then why should we care if the film is long? That's not to say it's not worth evaluating whether a movie should keep things simple or fill the runtime with as much detail as possible. In my mind, there's no better set of examples of this than with the two most well-known adaptations of the story of Moses. The Ten Commandments, directed by legendary filmmaker Cecil B. DeMille in 1956, and then The Prince of Egypt, produced by DreamWorks Animation in 1998. I had already wanted to make a video about these movies around the time of the Passover as well as Easter, and especially since The Prince of Egypt is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. I know that I'm late at this point, but part of the reason why I made these videos at the time I did is because the right angle to approach my video didn't really make itself clear until I heard about these runtime debates. Once I did, everything fell into place. After all, these two films are based off the same passages from both the Bible and the Torah, barring differences in translations in canonized scripture. Despite being based on roughly the same material though, they are vastly different in terms of length and genre. The Ten Commandments is about as emblematic of the classic Hollywood epic as they come, with a massive runtime of 220 minutes that includes a fully orchestrated overture and an intermission. The Prince of Egypt, however, clocks in at only 99 minutes with credits. You can literally watch the entire film before finishing the first disc of the Ten Commandments on Blu-ray. Even though I consider The Prince of Egypt to be the better and more impactful film, nobody would be in the wrong for choosing to watch the older production. And why is that, you might ask? Wouldn't it be easier to watch the shorter film? I mean, yeah, technically. Instead of setting aside 4 hours of your time to carefully study a very dense film, The Prince of Egypt can easily be watched while the family gathers together on the couch to eat dinner. But I'm not here to argue that one film is really better than the other. They're both very good in their own ways. What I do hope to get at, though, is that it doesn't matter what a movie's runtime is. It all depends on how the movie uses its time. In the same vein, I don't want this video to go on for too long either. I'll do my best to make this point as succinctly as I can. Let's take a look at the Ten Commandments first, with it being the older and significantly longer film. To justify its epic, elongated runtime, director Cecil B. DeMille walks onto a stage from behind a curtain and gives an introduction of what is about to be shown to the audience. It sets the proper tone for the production since, for one thing, DeMille makes it clear that the story was the result of both creative license when it comes to adapting the biblical material, along with influences from many different historians and scholars who consulted on the project. By bringing all of this up, it becomes evident that attention to detail was at the forefront of the director's mind. It then becomes a little odd when certain things happen and the audience doesn't have enough biblical context provided to them, but for the most part, the audience gets a pretty extensive rundown of what they're about to see in this story. Even with the hefty amount of detail being presented to the audience though, the film flows remarkably well. After all, to make its runtime work, it sets in motion a lot of different moving parts. A great deal of plot threads are established that ultimately get paid off later on. I suppose the runtime is also suitable given the highly theatrical tone. Yes, given its groundbreaking visual effects, enormous sets, and legions of extras, it comes across as highly theatrical in the sense that the audience is watching something cinematic. Were it not for the fact that there are no musical numbers, the Ten Commandments feels just a few steps away from being a filmic opera. The scale of the production matches the size of the plot and the multitude of characters that navigate through it. Performances also feel like they're the stuff of big, epic drama with a capital D, whether that be the big speeches, exaggerated physical expressions, or repeated confessions of love, such as what Nefertiti does for Moses. Cecil B. DeMille knew that he was making something grand in scale, and that awareness bleeds into all aspects of the production. This helps his film to remain on a firm foundation, which doesn't buckle under the weight of all its many moving parts. It's worth noting that the thematic goals are different from one film to the other. Beyond the tale of how Moses became God's instrument in delivering the Israelites from slavery, the film also shows how quickly people can forget God, even when they witness his wondrous feats of divine power. The screenplay does well to set up this conclusive message throughout the film, particularly in how various characters, including Charlton Heston's Moses, behave and ponder upon God's seeming ambivalence towards the Israelites' plight. Because of how much attention to this side of the narrative, other than the core thread of Moses seeking freedom for the Hebrews, the finale of Moses condemning the Israelite debauchery and creating and worshipping the golden calf is not only inevitable, but also earned. While this version of the story may ultimately be a heaping helping of movie that could be overwhelming to the less biblically literate, that doesn't mean its impact is any less effective. But as we pivot to The Prince of Egypt, the obvious difference here, as we discussed earlier, is that the runtime for covering the story of Exodus is significantly shorter. The film is pretty much over and done with in a matter of 90 minutes or so, making it easily palatable for both kids and adults. But because of very specific choices in how the story is told, the effect on the audience is still powerfully felt, in some cases even more so. With time working against the writers, they couldn't adopt the same approach of being as detail-oriented as possible. That's not to say that The Prince of Egypt isn't rich in detail, but the script couldn't be the main source of it. The choice to make a deeply emotionally charged musical was probably the best avenue that DreamWorks could have taken in telling this story in animated form. So, with this being the case, events from the Bible that were explored across lengthy periods of time in the Ten Commandments are covered in pretty much a couple of minutes at a time here. Thanks to the power of instrumentation and lyrics, emotional power is not lost in the effort to simplify things. Every single musical number in this movie is not only a straight-up banger, but the songs do well to move the story forward. The act of telling the story through music allowed the writers to focus their efforts on character development while keeping exposition to a minimum, since the movie's time is usually spent on deepening those characters' relationships when a song isn't playing. Even if one isn't Jewish or Christian, the gist of the plot wouldn't be lost on that individual. Another reason why this approach works is because the narrative goals are different here compared to the Ten Commandments, as I touched on earlier. While depicting the story of Moses and its message about God's unmatchable power was certainly not lost on the creative team, this is also a tragic tale of brothers who drift apart. No fat is left on the final cut of The Prince of Egypt due to the careful balancing act between sticking to what's written in the scriptures, while also keeping things centralized in Moses and Ramesses' initial unity and then eventual conflict. To make up for the lack of dense conversations, although what conversations do take place certainly are impactful, the language of cinema fills in the gaps. The medium of animation, in particular, is utilized to express ideas that actors performing on a stage just can't convey in the same way. For instance, when Moses comes to the realization that he's a Hebrew in the Ten Commandments, the reveal and his acceptance of Levite heritage takes place over a number of different scenes towards the middle chunk of the film, since there was a lot of dramatic setup to get to those moments. For The Prince of Egypt, this event is what bridges the first and second acts together, so it happens relatively early on. But its impact is no less powerful, since it's accompanied by a solo that encapsulates Moses' denial, only to be followed up by a nightmarish dream sequence that drives everything home. This sequence consists of animated hieroglyphs marching across the stone walls of the Egyptian palace, depicting the horrific events surrounding the massacre of Hebrew infants and the sacrifice that Moses' family made to save him. Rife with harsh lighting and narrative choices, along with musical leitmotifs that help to hammer home the feelings the audience should be experiencing, this sequence is emblematic to the film's overall approach to condensing parts of the story without downplaying their importance. When someone poses the question of how long a movie should be, I personally think that a movie is the big screen equivalent of a short story. You don't ever hear people complaining about how well films like Stand By Me or The Shawshank Redemption adapted Stephen King's novellas, because those stories are short enough to where they're more suitable to being covered within the span of 90 minutes or a little over 2 hours. The same can't be said about adaptations of much larger books that often piss off the fan base due to how much material might be left out or deliberately altered to fit within the confines of a feature-length runtime. As for original stories, it really just depends on how much the director and the editing team are able to hone in on the important details when assembling the final product. A movie is ultimately a very short commitment of time that is asked of the audience viewing it, even if the movie in question is over 3 hours long. The real determining factors for whether a movie can hold one's attention is if the viewer is able to get on the movie's wavelength, and then if the people making the movie can figure out how to pace everything well enough to where it flows appropriately for the story they're trying to tell. If you can share the same story in 90 minutes or in 200 minutes and still get the audience to care either way, then it doesn't really matter how long a movie ends up being. Either way, a movie just needs to justify its own length, regardless of what that might be. One would also do well to be patient, open-minded, and ready to take in whatever story that they are there to see. And that's it! Thank you for checking out this video that served a dual purpose as a holiday special, and just some general thoughts I had about movie length. If you liked what you saw and would be eager to see more of what I have to offer, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining the notification squadron so that you won't miss out on my future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great one.